Hello and welcome to today's story. My name is Philip, and I like to dive deep into scary Asian stories and cover them in my videos. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's story, where we have a few terrifying stories to share. One of them is this story. The footsteps always started around 2 a.m, soft at first, then deliberate, pacing the length of the corridor outside room 17. Jakob heard them on his second night at the hostel in Ulaanbaatar, lying awake in his bunk while the winter wind rattled the single-pane windows. He thought it was another guest, perhaps someone restless or drunk, but when he checked the hallway through the door's small glass panel, he saw nothing but dim yellow light and peeling wallpaper. The footsteps continued for another 10 minutes, back and forth, always the same rhythm, always stopping just outside his door before fading into silence. By morning, he had convinced himself it was the building settling or pipes expanding in the cold. But the unease remained, a small knot in his chest that wouldn't loosen. Jakob was traveling alone through Mongolia in late November, chasing cheap hostels and even cheaper meals as he made his way across Central Asia. He had arrived in Ulaanbaatar 3 days earlier, stepping off a rattling train into air so cold it burned his lungs. The city was a sprawl of Soviet-era apartment blocks and modern glass towers, all wrapped in a haze of coal smoke that hung low over the streets. He had chosen the hostel because it was the cheapest option listed online, a narrow building tucked between a shuttered convenience store and a dry cleaner that looked like it hadn't opened in years. The reviews were sparse and mostly old, a few mentioning decent beds and hot water, others complaining about noise and poor heating. One review, written in broken English, simply said, "Don't stay in room 17 if you can help it." But Jakob had dismissed it as a joke or a complaint about a bad mattress. The hostel itself was run by an older woman named Tuya, who spoke limited English and spent most of her time in a small office behind the front desk, drinking tea and watching Korean dramas on a tiny television. She had handed him a key without much ceremony, glancing at his passport and scribbling something in a ledger before waving him toward the stairs. The building smelled faintly of cabbage and disinfectant, and the hallways were narrow and poorly lit, with carpet so worn it was hard to tell what color it had originally been. Room 17 was on the second floor, at the far end of the corridor, a small dormitory with 4 bunk beds crammed together and a single window that looked out over an alley filled with snow and trash. When Jakob arrived, the room was empty, all the other beds stripped bare, their thin mattresses stained and sagging. He had chosen the lower bunk, nearest the door, dropping his backpack onto the floor and testing the mattress with one hand. It was firm enough, cold to the touch, and smelled faintly of old sweat and laundry detergent. He had spent the first evening exploring the city, walking through the central square and eating mutton dumplings at a small restaurant where no one spoke English and the menu was written entirely in Cyrillic. By the time he returned to the hostel, it was past midnight, and the building was silent except for the hum of a struggling heater somewhere in the walls. On the second night, Jakob woke to the sound of footsteps again, this time louder, more insistent. He lay in his bunk with his eyes open, staring at the underside of the bed above him, listening as the steps moved slowly down the hallway. They stopped outside his door, and for a long moment there was only silence, the kind of silence that felt heavy and deliberate, as though someone was standing just on the other side, waiting. Jakob held, his breath, his heart hammering in his chest, and then the footsteps resumed, moving away down the corridor until they faded completely. He sat up, swinging his legs over the edge of the bunk, and reached for his phone to check the time. It was 2:14 in the morning. He pulled on his jacket and opened the door, stepping into the hallway and looking both ways. The corridor was empty, the overhead lights flickering slightly, casting uneven shadows on the walls. He walked to the end of the hall and back, checking the other rooms, but all the doors were closed, and he heard no sound from any of them. When he returned to room 17, he noticed that the door to the bathroom at the far end of the corridor was slightly ajar, though he was certain it had been closed before. He approached it slowly, pushing it open with one hand, and found nothing inside but a cracked sink and a toilet with a broken seat. The air was colder here, almost freezing, and he could see his breath misting in front of him. He stepped back into the hallway, closing the bathroom door firmly, and returned to his room, locking the door behind him. Sleep did not come easily after that, and when it did, it was shallow and broken, filled with vague dreams of walking through snow and hearing voices he couldn't understand. The next morning, Jakob mentioned the footsteps to Tuya, asking if there were other guests on the second floor. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between concern and resignation, and shook her head. "No other guests," she said simply, turning back to her television. Jakob pressed her, asking if the building had thin walls or if the heating system made strange noises, but she only shrugged, sipping her tea and refusing to meet his eyes. Frustrated, he decided to spend the day outside, visiting the Ganden monastery and walking along the Tool River, which was frozen solid and covered in a thin layer of fresh snow. By the time he returned to the hostel that evening, he had nearly convinced himself that the footsteps were some quirk of the building, nothing more. But that night, as he lay in his bunk reading on his phone, he heard the sound again, and this time it was accompanied by something else, a low, rhythmic tapping, like knuckles rapping softly against wood. The tapping seemed to come from the hallway, moving closer to his door, and then stopping abruptly. Jakob set his phone down and listened, his pulse quickening, and then the door handle began to turn, slowly, as though someone was testing it. He had locked the door, he was certain of it, but the handle continued to move, rattling slightly, and then it stopped. The footsteps resumed, pacing back and forth outside his room, and Jakob could hear the faint creak of floorboards under weight. He grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing it at the door, and called out in English, asking if anyone was there. The footsteps stopped immediately, and the silence that followed was absolute, oppressive, as though the entire building was holding its breath. Jakob waited for several minutes, then got up and unlocked the door, pulling it open quickly. The hallway was empty, but the air felt wrong, colder than it should have been, and there was a faint smell, something like damp wool and old smoke. He stood in the doorway for a long time, staring down the corridor, and then he saw it, a shadow at the far end of the hall, near the bathroom, too tall and too still to be a trick of the light. It didn't move, didn't shift, just stood there, and Jakob felt a deep, instinctive fear settle over him, the kind of fear that bypassed thought and went straight to the gut. He stepped back into his room and locked the door again, his hands shaking, and spent the rest of the night sitting on his bunk with the light on, unable to sleep. By the fourth night, Jakob was exhausted, his nerves frayed from lack of sleep, and the growing certainty that something was very wrong with room 17. He had considered leaving, finding another hostel, but his budget was tight, and he had already paid for a week in advance. He tried to rationalize what he had seen, telling himself it was fatigue or stress or the unfamiliarity of a new place, but the fear remained, gnawing at him. That night, he decided to stay awake, to confront whatever was happening, to prove to himself that it was nothing. He sat on his bunk with his jacket on, his backpack ready by the door, and waited. The footsteps started just after 2, as they always did, pacing slowly down the hallway. Jakob listened, counting the steps. And then he heard something new, a sound like fabric dragging across the floor, heavy and deliberate. The footsteps stopped outside his door, and then the door handle began to turn again, but this time it didn't stop. The lock clicked, and the door swung open slowly, revealing the dim hallway beyond. Jakob's breath caught in his throat, and he stared at the open doorway, his mind racing, and then he saw him. A figure stood in the hallway, just outside the door, tall and hunched, wearing a dark, hooded jacket that obscured his face. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, and Jakob could feel the cold radiating from him, a cold that seemed to seep into the room and settle in his bones. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body wouldn't respond, frozen in place by a terror so profound it felt like drowning. The figure took a step forward, into the room, and Jakob could see his hands now, pale and thin, hanging at his sides. The figure moved to the bunk opposite Jakob's and sat down heavily, the mattress creaking under his weight, and then he leaned forward, staring at the floor, his face still hidden by the hood. Jakob could hear him breathing, slow and labored, each breath rattling in his chest, and the smell of damp wool and smoke was overwhelming now, filling the room. Time seemed to stretch, seconds feeling like hours, and then the figure stood up abruptly and walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway until they faded into silence. The door remained open, swinging slightly on its hinges, and Jakob sat there, trembling, unable to move or speak. When morning came, Jakob went straight to Tuya, demanding to know what had happened in room 17, why no one else stayed there, why she hadn't warned him. She looked at him for a long moment, her expression weary, and then she sighed and gestured for him to sit. She spoke slowly, her English halting but clear enough, and she told him about the traveler who had stayed in room 17 5 years earlier, during one of the coldest winters Ulaanbaatar had seen in decades. The man had been alone, a European backpacker like Jakob, traveling on a tight budget and staying in the cheapest hostels he could find. One night, the power had gone out across the entire district, a blackout caused by overloaded generators and failing infrastructure, and the temperature in the building had plummeted. The man had been found 3 days later, frozen in his bunk, still wearing his jacket and boots, his face pale and his eyes open. The authorities had ruled it an accident, a tragic consequence of the blackout and the extreme cold. But the hostel had never been the same after that. Guests who stayed in room 17 reported hearing footsteps, seeing shadows, waking to find the door open or the air unbearably cold. Some claimed to see the man himself, sitting on the bunks or standing in the hallway, always silent, always watching. Tuya had tried to close the room, to keep guests out, but the hostel's owner insisted it remain available, unwilling to lose the revenue. She apologized to Jakob, her voice quiet and sincere, and offered to move him to another room, but he shook his head. He had already decided to leave, to find another place, anywhere that didn't carry the weight of that presence. Jakob packed his things quickly, his hands still shaking, and checked out before noon, leaving the hostel without looking back. He found a small guest house on the other side of the city, more expensive but warm and bright, and spent the next few days trying to process what he had experienced. He told himself it had been stress, exhaustion, the power of suggestion, but he couldn't shake the memory of the figure sitting across from him, the sound of that labored breathing, the cold that had seeped into his bones. He left Ulaanbaatar a week later, continuing his journey east, but the nights remained difficult, filled with restless sleep, and the lingering fear that he might wake to find that hooded figure standing in the dark, waiting. And sometimes Late at night, when the wind howled outside his window, he thought he could still hear those footsteps, pacing slowly down an empty hallway, back and forth, never stopping, never leaving. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But the frozen hallways of Ulaanbaatar are not the only place where the dead refuse to rest. Across the continent, in the humid forests of Malaysia, another spirit lingers, waiting for those who wander too close. This is a story of grief and obsession, of a bride who never made it to her wedding, and the hikers who still encounter her on the trails of Taman Puteri. What starts as a legend quickly becomes something far more personal, and those who ignore the warnings often find themselves facing a terror they can never truly escape. The weeping always started just before dusk, soft and distant, carried on the wind through the dense trees of Taman Puteri. Amir heard it on his third hike along the forest trail, a low, mournful sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the undergrowth, just off the main path. He stopped walking, tilting his head to listen, and for a moment the sound grew clearer, almost distinct, the broken rhythm of someone crying. Then it faded, swallowed by the rustle of leaves and the distant calls of birds, and Amir convinced himself it was nothing, perhaps an animal or the wind playing tricks. He continued walking, his hiking boots crunching on the gravel path, but the unease stayed with him, a prickle at the back of his neck that refused to go away. By the time he reached the trailhead and returned to his car, the sun had set completely, and the forest behind him was a wall of black, impenetrable and silent. Amir had been hiking the trails around Taman Puteri for nearly a month, exploring the network of paths that wound through the forest reserve on the outskirts of Kuala Lumpur. He was 28, a graphic designer who worked from home and spent his weekends outdoors, seeking the kind of solitude and quiet that the city could never provide. The forest was his escape, a place where he could clear his mind and lose himself in the rhythm of walking, the simple pleasure of moving through green and shadow. Taman Puteri was one of his favorite trails, a 4-kilometer loop that followed a stream through thick jungle, past moss-covered rocks and towering dipterocarp trees. The trail was popular with locals, especially in the early mornings and late afternoons. But Amir preferred to hike later, when most people had already left, and the forest felt emptier, more his own. He had heard the stories about the trail, of course, the whispers about the ghost of Taman Puteri, a bride who was said to haunt the forest after vanishing on her wedding day. The details varied depending on who was telling the story. Some said she had been murdered by a jealous lover. Others claimed she had gotten lost in the forest and died of exposure. And still others insisted she had taken her own life, unable to bear the shame of being abandoned at the altar. Most people dismissed the stories as local folklore, the kind of ghost tale that every forest seemed to have, but there were enough reports, enough strange encounters, that the legend persisted. Hikers claimed to hear weeping along the trail, to see a woman in a torn red wedding gown walking between the trees, her face pale and streaked with tears. Some said she would follow you if you acknowledged her, trailing behind you through the forest, always just out of sight, and those who tried to approach her or speak to her often became disoriented, losing the trail and wandering for hours before finding their way out. Amir had always been skeptical of such things, more interested in the natural beauty of the forest than in supernatural speculation. But after hearing the weeping that evening, he found himself thinking about the stories more than he wanted to admit. The next time Amir hiked the trail, he brought his camera, hoping to capture some of the forest's atmosphere in the fading light. He started later than usual, arriving at the trailhead just after 5 in the evening, when the sun was already low and the shadows were beginning to stretch. The air was humid and heavy, thick with the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves, and the forest was alive with sound, the buzz of insects, the chatter of monkeys in the canopy, the distant rush of the stream. Amir walked slowly, stopping frequently to take photos, framing shots of light filtering through the trees and the way the trail curved around massive roots. He was about halfway through the loop, near a section where the path narrowed and the undergrowth pressed close on both sides, when he heard the weeping again. This time it was louder, more distinct, and it seemed to come from somewhere just ahead of him, deeper in the forest. He stopped walking, lowering his camera, and listened. The sound was unmistakable now, the soft, broken sobs of someone in deep distress, punctuated by sharp intakes of breath. Amir felt his pulse quicken, and he looked around, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The forest was still, the light dim and dappled, and he saw nothing unusual. He considered calling out, asking if someone needed help, but something held him back, a visceral hesitation that he couldn't quite explain. Instead, he stood there, listening, and then he saw her. She was standing about 20 meters off the trail, partially obscured by a cluster of ferns, a woman in a long red dress that looked ragged and stained. Her back was to him, her shoulders shaking, and her hair hung loose and tangled down her back. Amir's breath caught in his throat, and he took a step forward, his instinct to help overriding his fear. "Hello," he called out, his voice sounding too loud in the stillness. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman stopped crying immediately, her shoulders going rigid, and then she turned slowly to face him. Amir's stomach dropped. Her face was pale, almost gray, and her eyes were wide and dark, fixed on him with an intensity that felt wrong, predatory. Her dress was not a modern gown, but something older, torn and mud-stained, and there was something about the way she stood, too still, too deliberate, that sent a wave of cold fear through him. She took a step toward him, and then another, and Amir felt his body lock up, his feet rooted to the ground. She opened her mouth as though to speak, but no sound came out, only a low, rasping breath, and then she began to walk toward him, her movements slow and unnatural, as though she was gliding rather than stepping. Amir stumbled backward, his camera slipping from his hands and hitting the ground, and he turned and ran, crashing through the undergrowth and back onto the trail. He didn't stop running until he reached the trailhead, his lungs burning and his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. When he finally looked back, the forest was empty and silent, and there was no sign of the woman in red. Amir didn't return to Taman Puteri for 2 weeks, unable to shake the memory of what he had seen. He tried to rationalize it, telling himself it had been another hiker in costume, perhaps someone playing a prank, or that his mind had filled in details that weren't really there, creating a ghost out of shadow and fear. But the explanation felt hollow, and he couldn't forget the way the woman had looked at him, the emptiness in her eyes, the wrongness of her movement. He spent hours online, searching for information about the ghost of Taman Puteri, reading old forum posts and blog entries from hikers who claimed to have encountered her. The accounts were disturbingly consistent, descriptions of a woman in a red wedding gown, weeping or standing silently among the trees, always appearing near dusk or in the early morning. Several people reported feeling disoriented after seeing her, wandering off the trail and losing track of time, and one hiker claimed to have followed her deep into the forest, only to find himself at the edge of a steep ravine, with no memory of how he had gotten there. The most unsettling detail, repeated across multiple accounts, was that those who acknowledged her or tried to help her often experienced vivid nightmares afterward, dreams of being lost in the forest, of hearing her weeping but never being able to find her, of feeling watched even in their own homes. Amir read the accounts with growing dread, and he began to notice something strange in his own life, a sense of unease that followed him even when he was far from the forest. He found himself waking in the middle of the night, convinced he had heard crying, and when he closed his eyes, he saw flashes of red fabric and pale skin. The image burned into his memory. 3 weeks after his encounter, Amir decided to return to the trail, driven by a compulsion he didn't fully understand. Part of him wanted to prove that what he had seen was nothing, that the forest was just a forest and the ghost was just a story. But another part of him, deeper and harder to acknowledge, felt drawn back, as though something was pulling him toward Tamanputeri. He arrived at the trailhead in the late afternoon, the sky overcast and threatening rain, and the forest felt different this time, heavier, more oppressive. The air was thick and still, and the usual sounds of birds and insects were muted, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Amir started walking, his pace slower than usual, his senses heightened, and he felt a growing certainty that he was not alone. He reached the section of trail where he had seen the woman, and he stopped, looking into the trees. The undergrowth was dense and dark, and he saw nothing unusual, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming now, a physical pressure that made his skin crawl. He took a few steps off the trail, pushing through the ferns, and called out, his voice wavering. "I know you're here," he said, though he wasn't sure why he was speaking or what he hoped to accomplish. "I saw you. I want to understand." The forest remained silent, and then the weeping started again, closer this time, almost directly behind him. Amir spun around, his heart racing, and there she was, standing on the trail where he had just been, her red dress torn and stained, her face pale and expressionless. She was staring at him, and her lips moved as though she was speaking, but no sound came out. Amir felt his legs weaken, and he took a step back, his foot catching on a root, and he fell hard, his hands sinking into the wet earth. The woman began to walk toward him, her movements slow and deliberate, and Amir scrambled to his feet, turning and running deeper into the forest, away from the trail. He crashed through the undergrowth, branches tearing at his clothes, and he could hear her behind him, the soft rustle of fabric, the sound of footsteps that seemed to keep pace no matter how fast he ran. He ran for what felt like hours, his lungs burning, his vision blurring, and then he stumbled into a small clearing and stopped, gasping for breath. The clearing was empty, the trees pressing close on all sides, and when he looked back, the woman was gone. But the weeping continued, echoing through the forest, and Amir realized with a sinking horror that he had no idea where he was, that the trail was nowhere in sight, and the light was fading fast. Amir spent the next 3 hours trying to find his way back to the trail, stumbling through the forest as darkness fell and the temperature dropped. His phone had no signal, and his flashlight battery was dying, casting weak, flickering light that barely penetrated the shadows. He called out for help, his voice hoarse and desperate, but the forest remained silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant sound of the stream. He felt a growing panic, a fear that he might be lost for days, that he might never find his way out, and the weeping seemed to follow him, always just behind him, always out of sight. At one point, he thought he saw her again, standing between 2 trees, her red dress vivid even in the darkness, but when he blinked, she was gone. Finally, exhausted and shaking, Amir stumbled onto a narrow path, and he followed it blindly until he saw the lights of the parking area ahead. He emerged from the forest just after 10, his clothes torn and mud-stained, his hands bleeding from where he had scraped them on rocks and branches. He collapsed against his car, sobbing with relief, and when he looked back at the forest, he saw nothing but darkness and the faint outline of trees. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that she was still there, waiting, and that she would always be there. In the days that followed, Amir tried to put the experience behind him, to return to his normal life, but the forest had left its mark. He found himself unable to sleep, plagued by nightmares of being lost in the trees, of hearing the weeping but never finding its source, of seeing the woman in red standing at the foot of his bed, staring at him with those empty eyes. He stopped hiking, stopped going outdoors altogether, and he spent his days inside, the curtains drawn, unable to shake the feeling that he was being watched. Friends noticed the change in him, the way he had become withdrawn and nervous, and when they asked what was wrong, he couldn't find the words to explain. How could he tell them that he had seen a ghost, that he had been chased through the forest by a woman who should not exist, that he could still hear her weeping in the quiet moments when he was alone? The legend of Tamanputeri had become something real for him, something that haunted him, even in the safety of his own home, and he knew, deep down, that he would never be free of it. The forest had claimed something from him, some part of his peace and sanity, and no matter how far he ran, no matter how tightly he closed the doors, he could still feel her presence, lingering at the edge of his awareness, waiting. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. And while these stories already seem unbelievable, what comes next takes horror to a darker and more mysterious level. Because in the next part, the things that begin as coincidences twist into something far more terrifying. We move from forests and frozen hostels to places where the living and the dead collide in ways that defy understanding, where ordinary people are forced to confront realities that shatter everything they thought they knew. The fear becomes more intimate, more personal, and the line between the natural and the supernatural grows impossibly thin. The station platform was always empty after midnight, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh white glow over the concrete and the single vending machine that hummed quietly in the corner. Min-jun stood near the edge, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, waiting for the last train back to Seoul. He checked his phone for the third time, confirming it was 11:53, and glanced down the tracks into the darkness beyond the platform. The air was cold and still, carrying the faint smell of metal and oil, and the silence felt heavy, oppressive, in a way that made him shift his weight from foot to foot. Then he saw the boy, standing at the far end of the platform, near the yellow safety line, perfectly still and staring down the tracks. Min-jun blinked, startled, because he was certain the platform had been empty just moments before. The boy looked young, maybe 15 or 16, wearing a school uniform that seemed oddly formal for this time of night. His skin was pale, almost luminous under the lights, and his posture was rigid, unnatural. Min-jun felt a flicker of unease, something instinctive that told him to look away, but he couldn't. The boy didn't move, didn't acknowledge him, just stood there staring into the tunnel, and then Min-jun heard it, the low rumble of an approaching train, growing louder, the vibration thrumming through the platform. The boy stepped forward right to the edge, and Min-jun's heart lurched. He opened his mouth to shout, to warn him, but before he could make a sound, the freight train roared past, a blur of metal and noise, and when it was gone, the boy had vanished. Min-jun worked as an auditor for a mid-sized manufacturing company in Seoul, and his job often required late nights and long commutes. He had been staying in Jecheon for the past 2 weeks, conducting inventory checks at a regional warehouse, and he had grown familiar with the small city's rhythms, the quiet streets, the modest restaurants, and the train station that served as his lifeline back to the capital. Zhejiang Station was small, a single platform with a modest waiting room and a ticket booth that closed at 10. Most of the trains that stopped there were local commuters, with only a handful of express services running late into the night. Min-jun had taken the last train several times before, always finding the platform deserted, the station staff long gone, and the waiting room locked. It was a lonely place at that hour, but he had never felt particularly unsettled by it until tonight. He stood there now, staring at the spot where the boy had been, his mind racing to make sense of what he had just seen. The logical part of him insisted it had been a trick of the light, fatigue playing games with his perception, but he couldn't shake the image of the boy's pale face, the way he had stood so close to the edge, the absolute stillness of his posture. Min-jun walked slowly to the end of the platform, looking down the tracks, and saw nothing but darkness and the faint glow of distant signals. He checked his phone again, 11:56, and the last train was due in 4 minutes. He considered leaving, walking back to his hotel, but he had an early meeting in Seoul the next morning, and couldn't afford to miss the train. So he stayed, positioning himself near the center of the platform, away from the edge, and waited, his nerves on edge and his senses hyper-alert. The train arrived on time, a sleek express that hissed to a stop, its doors sliding open with a mechanical sigh. Min-jun stepped aboard, choosing a seat near the door, and as the train pulled away from the station, he looked back at the platform one last time. It was empty, the lights flickering slightly, and he saw nothing unusual, but the unease remained, a knot in his chest that refused to loosen. The next night, Min-jun finished work later than expected, and by the time he reached the station, it was past midnight. The platform was empty again, the vending machine humming its monotonous tune, and the air felt colder than it had the night before, biting through his jacket and making him shiver. He stood near the center of the platform, checking the arrival board, and saw that the last train was delayed by 10 minutes. He sighed, rubbing his hands together for warmth, and then he noticed the boy again. He was standing in the same spot, at the far end of the platform, near the yellow line, staring down the tracks. Min-jun's breath caught in his throat, and he felt a jolt of fear mixed with disbelief. The boy looked exactly as he had the night before, same uniform, same pale skin, same rigid posture, and Min-jun realized with a sinking certainty that this was not a coincidence, that something was very wrong. He walked slowly toward the boy, his footsteps echoing on the concrete, and as he got closer, he could see more details, the way the boy's hair was neatly combed, the way his shoes were polished and spotless, the way his hands hung at his sides, fingers slightly curled. Min-jun stopped a few meters away, his heart pounding, and called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Hey, are you okay? It's late. You shouldn't be standing so close to the edge." The boy didn't respond, didn't turn, didn't acknowledge him in any way. He just stood there, staring into the tunnel, and Min-jun felt a wave of cold wash over him, a chill that seemed to come from the boy himself. He took another step forward, reaching out as though to touch the boy's shoulder, and then he heard it, the rumble of an approaching train, but this time it sounded wrong, too fast, too loud, and Min-jun realized it wasn't a passenger train, but a freight train, barreling through the station without stopping. The boy stepped forward, right to the edge, and Min-jun lunged, grabbing for him, but his hands closed on empty air. The freight train roared past, a deafening wall of noise and wind, and Min-jun stumbled backward, his eyes squeezed shut against the rush of air and debris. When he opened them, the train was gone, and the boy had vanished. Min-jun stood there, gasping, his hands trembling, and he looked around the platform, searching for any sign of the boy. But there was nothing, no one, just the empty station and the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. Min-jun didn't sleep that night, his mind replaying the encounter over and over. The way the boy had moved, the coldness in the air, the impossibility of his disappearance. He spent the next day distracted, barely able to focus on his work, and when evening came, he considered skipping the train, finding a taxi or a bus, anything to avoid the station. But curiosity and a stubborn need to understand drove him back, and he found himself standing on the platform again, just after midnight, waiting. The boy appeared at 11:58, exactly as before, standing at the far end of the platform, staring down the tracks. Min-jun didn't approach this time, didn't call out. He just watched, his breath misting in the cold air, and he noticed something he hadn't seen before. The boy's uniform had a small emblem on the chest, a school crest that Min-jun recognized from one of the local high schools, and there was a faint stain on the collar, dark and irregular, that looked almost like blood. Min-jun felt his stomach turn, and he pulled out his phone, searching for information about the station, about accidents, about anything that might explain what he was seeing. He found a news article from 3 years earlier, a brief report about a teenage boy who had died at Jecheon Station, struck by a freight train while trying to save a friend who had stumbled too close to the edge. The article was sparse on details, mentioning only that the boy had pushed his friend to safety before being hit, and that his body had been found on the tracks early the next morning. Min-jun read the article twice, his hands shaking, and when he looked up, the boy was still there, standing at the edge, waiting. The freight train came, roaring through the station, and the boy stepped forward, vanishing as the train passed, and Min-jun understood with a cold, sinking certainty that this was not a haunting in the traditional sense, not a spirit seeking revenge or closure, but something else, a loop, a moment trapped in time, replaying endlessly, night after night, forever. Min-jun spoke to the station staff the next morning, a middle-aged woman who worked the ticket booth during the day shift. He asked her about the boy, about the accident, and she looked at him with a mix of pity and resignation. "You saw him," she said. Not a question, but a statement. Min-jun nodded, and she sighed, leaning back in her chair. "A lot of people see him, especially late at night. He's been there since the accident, always standing in the same spot, always disappearing when the freight train passes. We've tried to close the platform during those hours, to discourage people from being there, but the company won't allow it. They say it's superstition, that there's no evidence of anything unusual." She paused, her expression softening. "But I've seen him, too, once, a few years ago. It's not something you forget. The boy's name was Ji-hoon, and he was a good kid, always polite, always helping others. His friend survived, but Ji-hoon didn't, and now he's stuck there, reliving that moment over and over. Some people think he's trying to warn others, to keep them safe, but I think he's just trapped, unable to move on." Min-jun thanked her and left the station, his mind heavy with what he had learned. He finished his work in Jecheon 2 days later and returned to Seoul, but the image of the boy, standing alone on the platform, stayed with him. He found himself thinking about Ji-hoon at odd moments, wondering if the boy was aware of his situation, if he felt the cold, if he remembered anything beyond that final moment. And sometimes, late at night, when Min-jun was alone in his apartment, he thought he could hear the distant rumble of a train, and he would close his eyes and see Ji-hoon standing there, waiting, forever caught in the act of saving someone who was no longer there. Min-jun never returned to Jecheon Station, but he couldn't escape the memory. He began having dreams, vivid and unsettling, of standing on a platform, of seeing trains rush past, of reaching out and finding nothing but air. The dreams felt less like nightmares and more like echoes, as though some part of Ji-hoon's experience had imprinted itself on him, a fragment of that endless loop bleeding into his own life. He avoided train stations when he could, taking buses or taxis, and when he had no choice but to use the subway, he stood far from the edge, his back to the wall, unable to shake the fear that he might see Ji-hoon again, standing there in his school uniform, pale and still, waiting for a train that would never stop. The ghost of Jecheon Station had become part of his life, a quiet haunting that he carried with him, a reminder that some moments are so powerful, so final, that they refuse to end, echoing through time long after the people involved are gone. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But as chilling as that story was, it's far from the only one. In the Philippines, on a bridge that stretches over dark water, another ghost lingers, searching for something she can never have. Motorists who cross late at night speak of a woman who appears without warning, drenched and desperate, begging to be taken home. Those who stop to help, or those who ignore her, both face a terror that follows them long after they've left the bridge behind. This is the story of Iloilo Bridge, and the woman who refuses to leave it. The knocking started just after Carlo passed the midpoint of the bridge, 3 sharp raps on the passenger window that made him jump and swerve slightly in his lane. He was driving home from a late shift at the call center, the road nearly empty at 2 a.m, and the bridge stretched ahead of him, a long expanse of concrete and steel lit by intermittent streetlights. He glanced at the passenger window, expecting to see nothing, perhaps a bird or debris caught in the wind, but his breath caught when he saw her. A woman stood outside the car, her face pressed close to the glass, her eyes wide and pleading. She was drenched, her hair plastered to her face, water streaming down her cheeks, and her clothes clung to her body as though she had just climbed out of the river. Carlo's first instinct was to stop, to roll down the window and ask if she was okay, but something held him back, a visceral fear that he couldn't explain. The woman knocked again, harder this time, and her mouth moved as though she was speaking, but he couldn't hear her through the glass. Carlo pressed harder on the accelerator, pulling away, and when he looked in the rearview mirror, the woman was standing in the middle of the road, staring after him, her figure illuminated by his taillights. His hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and he didn't slow down until he was off the bridge and back on solid ground. Carlo had lived in Iloilo City his entire life, and he knew the bridge well, a vital connection between the city center and the residential neighborhoods on the other side of the river. During the day, the bridge was busy with traffic, cars and jeepneys and motorcycles jostling for space. But at night, it became something else, a lonely stretch of road where the only sound was the hum of tires on asphalt and the occasional rush of wind. Carlo had heard the stories about the bridge. Of course, everyone in Iloilo had. The ghost of Iloilo Bridge was a local legend, a woman who appeared to motorists late at night, always drenched, always desperate, begging to be taken home. The details of her story varied. Some said she had been murdered and thrown into the river. Others claimed she had jumped after a failed relationship, and still others insisted she had been kidnapped and drowned by strangers who had picked her up on the side of the road. The common thread in all the stories was that she had died in or near the water, and now she haunted the bridge, seeking a ride home that she would never complete. Most people dismissed the legend as superstition, the kind of ghost story that every city seemed to have, but there were enough reported encounters, enough witnesses who claimed to have seen her, that the story persisted. Carlo had always been skeptical, more concerned with practical matters like work and bills than with ghosts and hauntings. But after seeing the woman on the bridge, he found himself thinking about the stories in a new light. The fear he had felt was real, undeniable, and it lingered with him as he drove home, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see her standing in the back seat. The next night, Carlo took a different route, home, avoiding the bridge and driving through surface streets that added 20 minutes to his commute. He told himself it was a precaution, nothing more, that he was being sensible rather than superstitious. But the truth was he couldn't shake the image of the woman, her drenched face pressed against the glass, her eyes wide and desperate. He made it home without incident, but the detour became routine, and for the next week he avoided the bridge entirely, taking the long way around and arriving home, exhausted and irritable. His co-workers noticed the change in him, the dark circles under his eyes, the way he seemed distracted during meetings. And when they asked what was wrong, he brushed them off, unwilling to admit what he had seen. But the fear stayed with him, a low-grade anxiety that simmered just below the surface, and he found himself thinking about the bridge even when he was far from it, wondering if the woman was still there, still waiting, still knocking on windows and begging to be taken home. On the 8th night, Carlo's car broke down, the engine sputtering and dying on a side street halfway through his detour, and after an hour of trying to restart it, he gave up and called a friend for a ride. His friend, Miguel, picked him up and insisted on taking the bridge, arguing that the detour Carlo had been using was ridiculous and unnecessary. Carlo tried to protest, but Miguel laughed it off, and they drove onto the bridge just after 3 a.m. The road was empty, the streetlights casting long shadows on the asphalt, and Carlo felt his pulse quicken as they approached the midpoint. He stared out the window, searching the darkness for any sign of the woman, and then he heard it, 3 sharp raps on the window behind him. He spun around, his heart hammering, and there she was, standing outside the back seat, her face pressed against the glass, her eyes locked on his. Miguel didn't seem to hear the knocking, focused on the road ahead, and Carlo opened his mouth to say something. But before he could, the woman's expression changed, her pleading look twisting into something darker, something angry. She knocked again, harder, and the sound was louder now, more insistent, and Carlo felt a wave of cold wash over him, the temperature in the car plummeting. Miguel finally noticed something was wrong, glancing at Carlo with concern. "Hey, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Carlo couldn't respond, his eyes fixed on the woman outside the window, and then, impossibly, she was gone, and the knocking stopped. Miguel pulled over to the side of the bridge, putting the car in park and turning to Carlo. "Seriously, man, what's going on? You're freaking me out." Carlo told him what he had seen, the woman on the bridge, the knocking, the cold, and Miguel's expression shifted from concern to skepticism. "Come on, you've been working too hard. It's just stress, or maybe you saw someone who needed help and your brain filled in. The rest. There's no such thing as ghosts." Carlo wanted to believe him, but he couldn't shake the fear, and when they resumed driving, he kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, refusing to look back. They made it off the bridge without further incident, and Miguel dropped him off at home, still skeptical, but clearly unsettled by Carlo's reaction. Carlo went inside, locked the doors, and tried to sleep, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw the woman's face, her eyes wide and desperate, her mouth moving as though she was speaking words he couldn't hear. He lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of the house, the creak of floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, and he felt a growing certainty that he had made a mistake, that by ignoring the woman, by not stopping to help, he had done something wrong, something that would have consequences he couldn't yet understand. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. Carlo would wake in the middle of the night to the sound of dripping water, though his apartment was dry and there were no leaks. He would catch glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision, a shadow that seemed to follow him from room to room, always just out of sight. His car, which had been repaired and was running fine, began to smell faintly of river water, a damp, musty odor that no amount of cleaning could remove. And then, one night, he saw her again. He was sitting in his living room, scrolling through his phone, when he heard the knocking, 3 sharp raps on his front door. He froze, his blood running cold, and the knocking came again, louder, more insistent. He walked slowly to the door, his legs shaking, and looked through the peephole. The woman stood outside, drenched and staring directly at the door, her eyes wide and unblinking. Carlo stumbled backward, his breath coming in short gasps, and the knocking continued, relentless, echoing through the apartment. He grabbed his phone and called Miguel, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's here. She's at my door." Miguel tried to calm him down, telling him to call the police, but Carlo knew it wouldn't help, knew that this was something beyond what the police could handle. He sat in the middle of his living room, the knocking continuing for what felt like hours, and when it finally stopped, he felt no relief, only a deep, pervasive dread. He knew she would be back, that she had found him, and that ignoring her on the bridge had been the beginning of something he couldn't escape. Carlo returned to the bridge the next night, driven by a desperation he couldn't fully explain. He parked his car near the midpoint and got out, walking to the railing and staring down at the dark water below. The river was wide and slow-moving, its surface reflecting the lights of the city, and Carlo felt a crushing weight of guilt and fear. He called out into the darkness, his voice breaking. I'm sorry I didn't stop. I'm sorry I didn't help." The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint smell of river water, and then he saw her, standing at the edge of the bridge, her figure illuminated by the streetlights. She was staring at him, her expression unreadable, and Carlo felt tears streaming down his face. "Please, just tell me what you want. Tell me how to make this stop." The woman didn't respond, didn't move, and then she turned and walked to the railing, climbing over it with a fluid, unnatural grace. She looked back at him one last time, her eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it felt like a physical blow, and then she let go, falling into the darkness below. Carlo rushed to the railing, looking down, but the river was calm and empty, and there was no sign of her. He stood there for a long time, sobbing and shaking, and when he finally returned to his car, he felt hollow, as though something inside him had been carved out and left empty. He learned later, from an old newspaper article he found online, that a woman had been murdered on the bridge 15 years earlier, her body thrown into the river by men who had offered her a ride home. Her name was Maria, and she had been 23 years old, just starting her life. The article included a photo, and Carlo recognized her immediately, the same face, the same desperate eyes. He understood then that she wasn't seeking revenge or trying to harm anyone. She was simply lost, endlessly reliving the moment of her death, searching for a kindness that had been denied to her. And, by ignoring her, by driving away, he had become part of that cycle, another person who had turned away when she needed help. Carlo never crossed the bridge at night again, but the haunting didn't stop. He continued to see her in mirrors, in reflections, in the corner of his vision, always drenched, always watching. He moved to a different apartment, changed his phone number, even considered leaving Iloilo entirely, but he knew it wouldn't matter. Maria had found him, and she would never let him forget what he had done or what he had failed to do. The ghost of Iloilo Bridge had become his ghost, a constant reminder of the cost of fear and indifference, and he carried that weight with him every day, knowing that some mistakes can never be undone, and some ghosts can never be laid to rest. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. The last 2 stories are different. They're quieter, but far more disturbing, the kind that stay with you long after the telling ends. These are not tales of ghosts that appear and vanish in the night, but of something deeper, something that burrows into the fabric of everyday life and refuses to leave. In the final part, we encounter horrors that feel almost intimate, personal, as though they were waiting for the right person to stumble into their path. What follows? Next are stories of obsession and lingering presence, of things that should have ended but never did, and of the terrifying realization that sometimes the most frightening hauntings are the ones that feel the most real. The knocking came at 3:17 in the morning, soft and hesitant, 3 taps followed by a pause, then 3 more. Chen-Li woke instantly, her heart already racing, and she lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling, listening. The dormitory was silent except for the steady breathing of her roommate in the bed above, and Chen-Li tried to convince herself she had imagined the sound, that it was part of a dream already fading from memory. Then the knocking came again, clearer this time, and she realized it was coming from their door. She sat up slowly, her blanket clutched to her chest, and looked at the door. The gap beneath it showed a sliver of dim hallway light, and she could see shadows moving, the shape of feet shifting back and forth. Chen-Li's breath caught in Tom, her throat. No one should be awake at this hour. No one should be walking the halls, and certainly no one should be knocking on doors in the middle of the night. She considered waking her roommate, but before she could move, she heard a voice, soft and trembling, barely audible through the door. "Please, can you help me? I don't understand the problem. I need help with my studies." Chen-Li felt a cold wave of fear wash over her, and she pulled her blanket tighter, staring at the door as the knocking continued, patient and persistent. Chen-Li was a third-year engineering student at one of Shanghai's most prestigious universities, living in the Longhua dormitory complex on the eastern edge of campus. The dormitory was old, built in the 1980s, with narrow hallways and small rooms that housed 4 students each in bunk beds. The building had been renovated several times over the years, but it retained a certain dated quality, the kind of institutional bleakness that all old dormitories seemed to share. Chen-Li had moved into room 412 at the beginning of the semester, sharing the space with 3 other girls, though 2 of them had dropped out within the first month, leaving only Chen-Li and her roommate, Wei. The room was cramped and poorly ventilated, with a single window that looked out over a concrete courtyard, but Chen-Li had grown used to it, spending most of her time either in class or at the library, returning to the dorm only to sleep. She had heard the stories about Longhua Dormitory, of course, whispered conversations in the cafeteria, and late-night discussions in study groups. The ghost of Longhua Dormitory was a well-known legend on campus, a girl named Xu Ming who had hanged herself in one of the 4th-floor rooms after failing her final exams 5 years earlier. The details were vague and contradictory. Some students claimed Xu Ming had been under immense pressure from her family. Others said she had suffered from untreated depression, and still others insisted she had been bullied by classmates who had sabotaged her work. What everyone agreed on was that Xu Ming had died in the dormitory, and that her ghost now wandered the 4th floor at night, knocking on doors and asking for help with her studies. Students who had encountered her described the same experience. The soft knocking, the trembling voice, the overwhelming sense of dread that accompanied her presence. Some claimed that if you opened the door, you would see her standing in the hallway, pale and thin, her eyes unfocused, and that she would ask you to follow her, to help her study, to explain problems she could no longer understand. Those who followed her, the stories said, would feel an irresistible compulsion to do so, as though their will had been stripped away, and they would wake hours later with no memory of where they had been or what they had done. Chen Li had always dismissed the stories as superstition, the kind of urban legend that thrived in dormitories and late-night conversations. But now, listening to the knocking and the voice beyond the door, she felt the weight of those stories pressing down on her. Chen Li didn't open the door that night, and eventually the knocking stopped, the footsteps fading down the hallway until silence returned. She lay awake for the rest of the night, her body tense and her mind racing, and when morning came, she felt exhausted and on edge. Wei, her roommate, noticed something was wrong and asked if Chen Li was feeling okay. But Chen Li couldn't find the words to explain what had happened, couldn't articulate the fear that had gripped her. She told Wei she had slept poorly and left it at that, heading to class with dark circles under her eyes and a sense of unease that wouldn't dissipate. The day passed in a blur, and by evening, Chen Li had almost convinced herself that the knocking had been a prank, another student playing a joke, or perhaps a result of stress and lack of sleep. But that night, at 3:17 again, the knocking returned, soft and insistent, and with it the voice, plaintive and desperate. "Please, I need help." "I don't understand. Can you help me with my studies?" Chen Li sat up in her bunk, her heart pounding, and this time Wei woke too, her eyes wide in the darkness. "Do you hear that?" Wei whispered, and Chen Li nodded, unable to speak. They both stared at the door, and Chen Li saw the shadows beneath it again, the shape of feet shifting back and forth. Wei climbed down from her bunk and moved toward the door, and Chen Li felt a surge of panic. "Don't!" she hissed, reaching out to grab Wei's arm, but Wei shook her off, her expression determined. "It's probably just someone messing with us. I'm going to tell them to stop." Wei reached for the door handle, and Chen Li felt her stomach drop, a visceral certainty that opening the door would be a terrible mistake. "Wei, please don't," she begged, but Wei had already turned the handle and pulled the door open. The hallway beyond was empty, the fluorescent lights flickering slightly, casting uneven shadows on the walls. Wei stepped into the hallway, looking both ways, and Chen Li followed reluctantly, her legs shaking. The corridor was silent, every door closed, and there was no sign of anyone. Wei turned to Chen Li, her expression confused. "There's no one here. Maybe we both imagined it?" Chen Li shook her head, her eyes scanning the hallway, and then she saw her, at the far end of the corridor, near the stairwell. A girl stood there, thin and pale, wearing an old-fashioned school uniform that looked faded and worn. She was staring at them, her face expressionless, and Chen Li felt a wave of cold fear wash over her. Wei followed Chen Li's gaze and gasped, stepping backward into the room. The girl didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching them, and then she turned and walked toward the stairwell, her movements slow and deliberate. Chen Li felt an almost overwhelming urge to follow her, to walk down the hallway and ask what she needed, and she took a step forward before Wei grabbed her arm, pulling her back into the room and slamming the door shut. Over the next week, the knocking continued every night at the same time, and the compulsion to open the door grew stronger. Chen Li found herself lying awake each night, waiting for it, her body tense and her mind filled with thoughts of the girl in the hallway. She began researching Xu Ming, searching online for articles and forum posts about her death, and she found more than she expected. Xu Ming had been a brilliant student, at the top of her class, but in her final year, she had begun to struggle, her grades slipping as the pressure mounted. Her parents had high expectations, and Xu Ming had felt the weight of those expectations crushing her. The night before her final exams, she had been seen in the library, studying late into the night, her face drawn and her eyes red from crying. She had returned to her dorm room and hanged herself from the ceiling fan, and her body had been found the next morning by her roommates. The university had kept the details quiet, not wanting to draw attention to the tragedy, but students who had known Xu Ming spoke of her obsession with studying, her belief that failure was not an option, and the crushing guilt and shame that had driven her to take her own life. Chen Li read the accounts with growing dread, and she began to understand that Xu Ming's ghost was not malicious or vengeful, but trapped, endlessly reliving the moments before her death, desperately seeking help that had never come. The knocking was not a threat, but a plea, and the compulsion to follow her was not supernatural coercion, but the echo of Xu Ming's own desperation, so powerful that it resonated even in death. Chen Li felt a deep sadness mixed with fear, and she wondered if there was any way to help Xu Ming, to give her the peace she had never found in life. One night, unable to bear the knocking any longer, Chen Li decided to open the door. Wei had moved to a different room by then, unwilling to stay in 412 any longer, and Chen Li was alone. When the knocking came at 3:17, Chen Li got out of bed, her hands trembling, and walked to the door. She took a deep breath and pulled it open, and there stood Xu Ming, pale and thin, her eyes unfocused and filled with a sadness so profound it felt like a physical weight. She looked at Chen Li and spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, can you help me? I don't understand the problem. I need to study. I can't fail." Chen Li felt tears welling in her eyes, and she nodded, stepping into the hallway. Xu Ming turned and walked toward the stairwell, and Chen Li followed, the compulsion strong but not overwhelming, driven more by compassion than by fear. They walked down the stairs to the 3rd floor, and Xu Ming led her to a small study room at the end of the corridor. The room was empty, lit by a single overhead light, and Xu Ming sat down at one of the desks, pulling out a worn notebook filled with equations and diagrams. She looked at Chen Li, her expression desperate. "I can't solve this. I've tried so many times, but I can't understand. Can you help me?" Chen Li sat down beside her and looked at the notebook. The problems were advanced calculus, the kind of material she herself was studying, and she realized with a chill that these were the problems Xu Ming had been working on the night before her death. Chen Li picked up a pen and began to work through the problems, explaining each step carefully, and Xu Ming watched intently, her eyes fixed on the page. They worked for what felt like hours, and Chen Li felt a strange sense of peace, as though she was doing something important, something that mattered. When they finished the last problem, Xu Ming looked at Chen Li and smiled, a small, sad smile, and then she stood up and walked to the window. She looked out at the campus, the lights of the buildings twinkling in the distance, and she turned back to Chen Li one last time. "Thank you," she said softly, and then she was gone, her figure fading like mist in the morning Sunday. Chen Li sat in the study room for a long time, staring at the empty chair where Xu Ming had been, and she felt a deep sense of loss and relief. She never heard the knocking again, and the 4th floor of Longhua Dormitory felt different after that, lighter somehow, as though a weight had been lifted. Other students reported that the hauntings had stopped, that the ghost of Xu Ming was no longer seen in the hallways, and Chen Li knew, with a certainty she couldn't explain, that she had helped Xu Ming find the peace she had been searching for. But the experience stayed with her, a reminder of the fragility of life and the crushing weight of expectations. And she found herself thinking about Shuming often, wondering what her life might have been like if she had been given the help she needed, if someone had been there to tell her that failure was not the end, that there was always another chance. Chenli graduated 2 years later and moved to a different city, but she never forgot Shu Ming, and she carried the memory of that night with her, a bittersweet reminder of the cost of pressure and the importance of compassion. The ghost of Longhua Dormitory had become something more than a legend for her, a real person who had suffered and died, and whose story deserved to be remembered. And sometimes, late at night when Chenli was working on a difficult problem or feeling overwhelmed by stress, she thought she could hear Shu Ming's voice, soft and gentle, reminding her that it was okay to ask for help, that no one should have to face their struggles alone. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But not all ghosts seek help or redemption. Some are lost in a different way, searching for something they can never find, trapped in a violence that defined their final moments. On the slopes of Mount Kinabalu, where the air grows thin and the trails narrow to cliffside paths, climbers speak of a presence that walks behind them in the early morning light. It is a figure without a head, moving with purpose along the edge, and those who have seen it know to remain silent, to keep their eyes forward, and to never, under any circumstances, acknowledge what follows them. This is a story of ancient wounds and restless spirits, of a warrior who died in shame and now wanders the mountain, forever searching for what was taken from him. The footsteps started just after dawn, soft and deliberate, following Marcus and his guide along the narrow cliffside trail near the summit of Mount Kinabalu. Marcus heard them clearly, the crunch of boots on gravel, the steady rhythm of someone walking close behind, and he glanced over his shoulder, expecting to see another climber. The trail was empty, the morning mist swirling around the rocks, and there was no one there. He turned back to his guide, a local man named Jamelin, who had climbed the mountain hundreds of times, and was about to mention the sound when Jamelin raised a hand sharply, his expression tense. "Don't speak," Jamelin said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't look back again. Just keep walking." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine, and he nodded, focusing on the trail ahead. The footsteps continued, matching their pace exactly, and Marcus's hands began to shake. He wanted to ask what was happening, why they couldn't look back, but Jamelin's warning had been clear, and the fear in the guide's eyes told him that this was something serious, something dangerous. They walked in silence for another 20 minutes, the footsteps never faltering, and Marcus felt a growing sense of dread, the kind of fear that comes from knowing something is very wrong, but not understanding what or why. Marcus was a documentary filmmaker from Australia, traveling through Southeast Asia to film a series about remote mountain trails and the cultures that surrounded them. Mount Kinabalu, located in the Malaysian state of Sabah, was one of the highest peaks in the region, and Marcus had been planning this climb for months. He had hired Jamelin through a local trekking company, impressed by the guide's experience and knowledge of the mountain. They had started the climb 2 days earlier, spending the first night at a base camp and beginning the final ascent to the summit before dawn on the second day. The climb was challenging but manageable, the trail winding through dense jungle before opening onto rocky slopes and narrow ridges. Marcus had filmed extensively during the ascent, capturing the changing landscape and the stunning views, and he had been in high spirits as they approached the summit. But now, walking along the cliffside trail, with footsteps following them and Jamelin's warning still ringing in his ears, Marcus felt all his enthusiasm drain away, replaced by a cold, creeping fear. When they finally reached a wider section of trail where the cliff gave way to open ground, Jamelin stopped and turned to face Marcus, his expression grave. "We're safe now," he said, and Marcus noticed that the footsteps had stopped. "What was that?" Marcus asked, his voice shaking. Jamelin hesitated, looking back at the trail they had just walked, and then he sighed. "It's the Headless Warrior. Many climbers hear him on the cliffside trail, especially at dawn. He walks behind you, and if you acknowledge him, if you speak or look back, he becomes angry. Some people say he follows them down the mountain, that they feel him watching them for days afterward. The guides here, we know the stories. We tell climbers to stay silent when they hear the footsteps, to keep their eyes forward and not to acknowledge him. Most of the time, he just follows for a while and then disappears. But not always." Jamelin explained the legend as they rested on a flat rock overlooking the valley below. The Headless Warrior, according to local tradition, had been a tribal leader centuries ago, a man of great strength and courage who had defended his people against invaders. During one of the battles, he had been captured and executed, his head severed and taken as a trophy by the enemy. His body had been thrown off the cliffs of Mount Kinabalu, left to rot on the rocks below, and his head had never been recovered. The warrior's spirit, unable to find peace without his head, was said to wander the mountain, searching endlessly for what had been taken from him. Climbers reported seeing a headless figure walking the cliffside trails, always at dawn, always moving with purpose, and those who encountered him spoke of an overwhelming sense of dread, a fear that went beyond rational explanation. Some climbers claimed to hear whispering when the footsteps followed them, words in a language they didn't understand, and others reported feeling a cold hand on their shoulder, even though there was no one there. Jamelin spoke quietly, his eyes scanning the trail, and Marcus could see the genuine fear in his expression. "I've climbed this mountain for 20 years, Jamelin said. "I've heard the footsteps maybe 5 or 6 times. Each time, I do what I was taught. Stay silent, keep walking, don't look back. And each time, he eventually leaves. But I know climbers who didn't follow the rules, who turned around or spoke, and they've told me things that I don't like to think about." One man said the warrior followed him all the way down the mountain and appeared in his hotel room that night, standing at the foot of his bed. Another woman said she felt hands around her neck for weeks after, like someone was trying to strangle her. The mountain guides, we take these stories seriously. This isn't superstition for us. It's something we respect. Marcus felt a deep unease settle over him, and he looked back at the cliffside trail, now shrouded in mist. He wanted to dismiss what had happened, to rationalize it as wind or echoes, or the product of altitude and fatigue, but he couldn't shake the memory of those footsteps, the way they had matched his pace exactly, the palpable sense of presence that had followed them. They continued their descent, reaching the base camp by midday, and Marcus tried to focus on his filming, interviewing Jamelin about the mountain's history and the local traditions. But his mind kept returning to the footsteps, and he found himself glancing over his shoulder repeatedly, unable to shake the feeling that something was still watching him. That night, back at the base camp, Marcus had trouble sleeping. He lay in his tent, listening to the wind and the distant sounds of the jungle, and he thought he heard footsteps again, soft and deliberate, circling the camp. He sat up, his heart pounding, and looked out through the tent's mesh window. The campsite was empty, the other tents dark and silent, and he saw nothing unusual. But the footsteps continued, moving around his tent in slow circles, and Marcus felt a cold sweat break out on his skin. He considered calling out to Jamelin, whose tent was nearby, but he remembered the guide's warning and stayed silent, pulling his sleeping bag up to his chin and waiting for the sounds to stop. Eventually they did, fading into the night, and Marcus lay awake until dawn, too afraid to close his eyes. The next day, they completed the descent and returned to the town at the base of the mountain. Marcus thanked Jamelin and paid him, but the guide looked at him with concern. "You heard him again last night, didn't you?" Jamelin asked, and Marcus nodded, too exhausted to lie. Jamelin sighed. "I was afraid of that. Sometimes, when people hear the footsteps on the cliffside trail, the warrior follows them, even after they leave the mountain. It doesn't happen to everyone, but when it does, it can last for days or even weeks. The best thing you can do is to not acknowledge him, to go about your life as normally as possible, and eventually he will lose interest and return to the mountain." Marcus asked if there was anything else he could do, any way to make the haunting stop, and Jamelin shook his head. "The warrior is searching for his head. That's all he knows. You can't give him what he's looking for, so all you can do is wait until he moves on." Marcus felt a crushing sense of despair, and he thanked Jamelin again before returning to his hotel. He spent the next 2 days in town, trying to edit his footage and prepare for the next leg of his journey. But the footsteps continued. He heard them in his hotel room, in the hallways, even in the crowded market where he stopped to buy supplies. Always the same steady rhythm, always just behind him, and always accompanied by that deep, visceral dread. He stopped sleeping, afraid of what he might see if he closed his eyes, and his mind began to play tricks on him, shadows seeming to move on their own, sounds becoming distorted and menacing. On the third night, Marcus woke to find a figure standing at the foot of his bed. It was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like old tribal clothing, and where its head should have been, there was only a ragged stump, the neck ending in torn flesh and exposed bone. Marcus tried to scream, but no sound came out, his voice locked in his throat by sheer terror. The figure didn't move, didn't make any sound. It just stood there, and Marcus could feel its attention, the way it was focused on him even without eyes to see. The room was freezing, his breath misting in front of him, and he pulled his blanket up as though it could protect him. The figure remained for what felt like an eternity, and then it turned and walked toward the window, passing through it as though it were made of mist. Marcus sat up, gasping for breath, and he stumbled out of bed, turning on every light in the room and checking the locks on the door and windows. He didn't sleep for the rest of the night, and when morning came, he packed his bags and left the hotel, determined to leave Saba and move on to the next location on his itinerary. But the footsteps followed him to the airport, onto the plane, and when he arrived in his next destination, he heard them in his new hotel room. The same steady rhythm, the same sense of presence. It was 2 weeks before the haunting finally stopped. Marcus had given up trying to run from it, accepting that the warrior would follow him until he chose to leave, and he went about his life as best he could, filming his documentary, conducting interviews, and trying to ignore the footsteps that shadowed his every move. He stopped acknowledging them, stopped looking over his shoulder, and eventually, slowly, the presence began to fade. The footsteps grew quieter, less frequent, and the sense of being watched lessened. One morning, Marcus woke and realized he couldn't hear the footsteps anymore, and he felt a wave of relief so powerful it brought tears to his eyes. He completed his documentary and returned to Australia, but the experience stayed with him, a dark shadow that he couldn't fully shake. He included a segment about Mount Kinabalu and the legend of the Headless Warrior in his film, interviewing Jamelin and other guides, and he tried to convey the terror he had felt, the way the haunting had consumed him. But he knew, watching the finished film, that no amount of footage or narration could truly capture what he had experienced. The depth of fear and helplessness that had gripped him for those 2 weeks. The Headless Warrior had become part of his story, a reminder that some things cannot be explained or understood, only endured. And sometimes, late at night, when Marcus was alone and the world was quiet, he thought he could still hear the footsteps, soft and distant, a reminder that the mountain had not forgotten him, and that the warrior's search would never end. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.